I ask members to take their seats and sign in. We got a couple minutes before we have to start.
Well, technically you have 30 minutes.
I like to start on time.
We do.
Good morning, councillors. Welcome to the Corporate Services Committee of May 10th. At this point, I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask that we turn our electronic devices to vibrate or silent mode, please. Councillor Timms. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Timms. I'm just wondering if we have, I'm looking to Councillor Edgar for a motion with respect to the agenda items.
Thank you, Chair. I have a resolution I moved by myself, seconded by Brian Height, that the order of the agenda be amended to move consent items for information RD CP TF-C 7-2017, RD CP TF-C 8-2017, RD CP TF-C 9-2017, and CSC-C 10-2017, agenda items 6.1 through 6.4 to immediately following the delegations on the same matter, agenda item 4.
Thank you, Councillor Edgar and Councillor Height. That's quite a mouthful, first thing in the morning. The purpose for this is to consider all the development charges, correspondence and items at the same time after the presentation. Seeing no questions or comments to the motion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Thank you very much. At this time, I'll also ask if there's any disclosures of pecuniary interest to the amended agenda. Councillor Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have want to declare indirect pecuniary interest on the items we just moved forward regarding development charges, as they do have an effect or may have an effect on a family business. So with that understanding, I will not participate or influence debate, but I will remain seated here to become informed, at least on the policy, without influencing the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Timms. We won't even look for the raised eyebrow. I'm asking now for Ms. Murphy to introduce our presenter on the delegation.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, I'd like to introduce Nancy Neal from Watson's.
Good morning, members of council, Chair Quirk. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to walk you through a presentation. There are quite a few slides. We've handed out hard copies to you, but I'll try and move through them quite quickly to give you an overview of where the development charges sit as of today and what we need to move forward. So the development charges is a legislative process that we have been going through for a year now. The Development Charges Act has been in place for quite some time. It was recently updated in January 1st, 2016 through Bill 73. So I'm going to walk you through some of the changes that have happened because of that we've had to deal with in this process as well. And then subsequent to my presentation, there'll be a discussion on the policies that are included in the final bylaw that will go forward for passage in June and to the public meeting as well. And we can discuss any issues that you have at that time. So to walk you through the study process that we have been involved with to date, there has been an ongoing coordination with the Municipal Comprehensive Review, the Water Wastewater Master Plan Study, and the Transportation Master Plan Study to come up with the inputs into the Development Charge Background Study, as well as discussions with regional staff from a number of other departments to come up with the background information that we've required and needed to calculate the development charges that are currently in the background study. We've developed from the MCR work the growth forecast that is to be used in the development charge background study. I'll walk you through some of that in a bit more detail in the slides to come. We've had many policy discussions with staff to date. We've also, back in September, had a council workshop to go through some of the higher level policies and stuff. We have met 3 times with the local area municipalities. As well, there's been additional meetings that regional staff have had with the local area CBOs through the process. And we've also had 3 meetings with non-government stakeholders. We had joint public information centers back at the end of November, beginning of December last year with the MCR Water Wastewater Transportation Master Plan teams. We've had a number of different task force meetings. We then came forward with draft calculations in April of this year and had some further policy alignment meetings with the local area municipalities. We had a DC task force meeting on April 11th. There was also to be one on April 19th. Unfortunately, that one was deferred, and that's why we are here today. In the meantime, though, between the task force meeting on the 11th and today, we did, for statutory reasons, have to release the background study to meet the timeline requirements in the Act to ensure that you have the proper time to pass a bylaw prior to your current bylaw expiring. So we're here today to go over everything, and we will then be moving forward with, I understand the Transportation Master Plan and Water Wastewater Master Plan will be going to committee at the end of this month. The public meeting for the DC, which is statutory, is scheduled for June 8th. And then we're anticipating the bylaw will be considered by council on June 29th. So quick high level for those of you who haven't maybe been in all of our other meetings to date, development charges are to recover the incremental growth capital costs associated with both non-residential and residential growth within the region. They are capital costs that are normally in addition to what would be the requirements of a subdivision or site plan agreement for internal works. And the municipalities, including the region, are empowered to have the charges imposed through the Development Charges Act versus other legislation. So the DC in 1997 is well, actually, development charges have been the first act came into play in 1989. There was a major update in 1997, which provided service limitations that could be included, restrictions on service standards, mandatory reductions, mandatory exemptions. Since 97, the first real update that has taken place is through Bill 73, which received royal assent in December 2015 and came into force January 1st, 2016, with no grandfathering at all in any of the changes. So we've had to embrace them all in this study. So I'm just going to go through kind of a quick overview of what the Act does exclude and include. So there are some services that cannot be included. They include the general headquarters for the administration, so the majority of this building is ineligible. And arts, sorry, I didn't forward it there. Arts, cultural, museum, and entertainment facilities, except for libraries, are excluded, even though there may be growth components related to them. Tourism facilities, provisions for hospitals, even though municipalities have to contribute a component towards expansion of hospitals. Parkland acquisition is excluded. And waste management services used to be excluded, but with Bill 73, there was an update to allow recycle, reuse, anything to do with waste diversion. So incineration and landfill is still ineligible, but anything to do with the waste diversion is now eligible. How the development charges very, very high level, and we look at all of the costs that are related to what the needs are to service growth. That is our numerator in our calculations. Very simplified. And then we divide that into the growth anticipated. And that's how we come up with our development charges. And there are slightly different charges and denominators for residential versus non-residential, and we'll get into that. High-level relationship between the needs for service, for servicing growth, and the funding. Obviously, once we've identified what the needs for servicing growth are, there's only a limited number of ways of recovering for that. If you choose for some reason not to impose all of the development charges that are calculated, as well as providing for any exemptions, deductions, reductions, or other granting programs within the development charges background study, those costs that are then not collected through the development charges have to be funded from other sources, whether that be taxes, water, wastewater rates, other user fees, or grants and subsidies that you may be able to get in the future. High level, for every approximate $3 million that are not collected through development charges equals about a 1% increase on the regional tax base. Capital costs that can be included, there's quite a bit. There's the acquisition for land or an interest in land, the improvement of land, to acquire, lease, or construct new buildings for facilities and structures, including the furnitures and equipment that go into those facilities, equipment and rolling stock for your fleet, capital components of a lease for any of the above, the circulation of materials for libraries, studies that relate to any of the development charge eligible services, and any interest on money borrowed to pay for any of the capital that is required due to growth. There are certain capital costs that may be limited to be as to what may be included. For example, vehicles and equipment, the Act states that there has to be an average life of 7 or more years for inclusion in the DC. And computer equipment is also excluded. However, there are a lot of things like your water, wastewater plants are now very highly computerized, and there was cases that went to the OMB that said, with decisions that said that if the computer equipment is integral to providing the service, such as it is with the water and wastewater plants, then it is included. This is meant to be your laptops, your desktops, your servers, that sort of thing. So that's what's excluded. As well, for any services that are considered what we call non-hard services or soft services, there is a mandatory 10% deduction in the calculations that have to take place. The hard services are anything related to water, wastewater, stormwater, roads, fire, and police. Now, with Bill 73, they also removed the 10% deduction required for transit. So if there was transit ever included in the DC, that wouldn't have the mandatory deduction either. The planning horizons that are we're allowed to deal with in the development charge studies is limited to 10 years, except for those hard services. So for the hard services that are included right now, water, wastewater, roads and public works, fire, or not, well, police for yourselves, we're actually looking at a 25-year growth forecast out to 2041. For all other services, we're limited to 10 years, so we are looking out from 2017 to 26 for that time period. Any capital costs that are identified must be reduced by any known grants, subsidies, or other contributions that are anticipated. And then the costs that are incurred, that can be incurred on behalf of other municipalities and local boards can be included if there's a regional component that you pay towards that. This quite often happens with smaller municipalities who may share recreation facilities or fire services, that sort of thing. The service standards that we have to look at in the calculations provides a ceiling of what you can collect in the future. So the Act talks about what you have provided on average over the last 10 years. You cannot charge the future growth any more than that average. And the one exception that was made change as per Bill 73 was regarding transit, and it is now a forward-looking forecast based on ridership of each type of mode of transit. So that's the only one. All other services have to look backwards. There is for water, wastewater, and stormwater, this historic service standard calculation is not required because there is other legislation that overrides the development charge legislation that mandates what you shall build and at what standard you shall build today. With these service standards, we have to consider both quantity and quality measures. So for example, quite often we look at the size of your facilities and what as the quantity for the total square footage, and then the quality is the replacement value. So this involves keeping track of inventories over historic 10-year periods for all services except the water, wastewater in your case. The local service policy, the Act talks about having to identify a local service policy to make it clear to the development community as to what are going to be the conditions of a subdivision or site plan or development agreement as 100% the cost of developing the land versus the higher need order projects that will have a broader benefit, and those are the ones that will go into the development charges. Bill 73 added a clause on no additional levies, and we will discuss that a little bit further as we get into a little more detail, but it reiterates why there is a clear need to make sure that your local service policy identifies what the developments are required to do on their own, so that you don't miss out on being able to collect for some type of infrastructure works that are needed. So some of the items that we are consider in the local service are the types of roads, whether or not collector roads versus arterial roads, whether they're internal or external to the developments, would be included. What happens with intersection improvements, traffic signalization, street lights and sidewalks. And then as well, there's bike routes, bike lanes, the multi-use paths that are all dealt with in there as well. Any noise abatement measures, land dedications or easements that are required. And then for water, wastewater and storm, we're looking usually at the minimum size of pipes that are required for the development. Internally would be the responsibility of the developer versus the oversizing and larger type pipes, treatment facilities, pumping stations that would go into the development charges. There are a few other matters that we have to turn our minds to when calculating the development charges, and that includes any excess capacity. So if something has been built in the past and it wasn't indicated at that time that there was a growth component and that it was going to be collected from development charges, then we can't recover for it going forward. The development community, as they come in, benefit from that with no cost to them. Cross-subsidization is another one that the Act clearly states cannot take place. So if, for example, you decided to exempt a type of non-residential development, you cannot take the costs that you cannot collect from them and then charge it to other types of non-residential or residential development. It does have to be funded then from those other tax rate, user fee type sources. There is an examination needed of the long-term capital and operating impacts for all the infrastructure that is required. So we don't want you building a new facility and then not being able and understanding that there's operating costs then to maintain and run that facility and staff it in the future. So we do a calculation to show the impacts of those day-to-day operating impacts, as well as future replacement, life cycle replacement on that facility or new piece of infrastructure. So the development charge background study, the public process has been extended as per Bill 73. In the past, you had to give 20 days notice of a public meeting, release the background study within 2 weeks prior to that public meeting, and then hold the public meeting, and after that, you could pass the bylaw. Now, with the new changes, we have a 60-day period between when the background study is released and when you can consider the bylaw. We still have to do the same notice for the public meeting and such and hold it, but there is that 2-month period now between release and first consideration of the bylaw. The Act also allows for indexing of the charges, which takes place annually to ensure that the costs that you're collecting are staying with inflation over time. And there is a prescribed index that the Act sets out that you must use for that annual indexing. There are mandatory exemptions set out in the Act that include the expansion for up to 50% of an existing industrial building. There's also a number of residential intensification exemptions. So you can add up to 2 apartments in a single detached dwelling unit, and as long as you don't more than double the size of the current facility, you don't have to pay a development charge. And then for any other type of residential unit, semi-detached towns, apartments, you can add 1 additional unit without having to pay development charges. And then there's also an exemption, so between upper and lower tier municipalities and the school boards. If you were to build a facility, the locals and school boards wouldn't charge you their development charges. If they were building a facility, you wouldn't impose the regional charge on them either. Discretionary exemptions are allowable in the Act. They may reduce in whole or part the development charges for types of developments, classes of developments, such as industrial or churches. You can phase in the calculated rates over any time within the 5-year term of the bylaw. And then there's also redevelopment credits, which isn't mandatory, it is discretionary. However, through the OMB, there's case law that pretty much provides that every municipality should allow for a redevelopment credit. So if I knock a single family home down or it burns down with a fire, I should be able to replace my home without having to pay a development charge. For non-residential, if I was to knock down 10,000 square feet and I'm going to replace that building with 20,000 square feet, the first 10,000 square feet would be exempt from the charge. With Bill 73, there has been a number of changes, including some new definitions. They have put in a definition regarding prescribed, which is a reference that may be contained in the regulations. Currently, the only thing that is prescribed is in regards to transit. The regulations have been updated. There's some changes. Obviously, the most dramatic changes were in relationship to transit. This doesn't apply to the region, but the 10% mandatory deduction has been removed. The planned level of service, like I said, it is no longer historic, it's forward-looking, and it's based on ridership forecasts for capacities of each different mode of transit over 10 years, and then also you need to look at what is required in the 10 years following your first 10-year period and identify that. There's also extensive asset management requirements set out for the transit component only at this point, although asset management is needed for all services. It's very prescribed for transit. For yourselves right now, you may be wondering why we have not included the intermunicipal transit component. We did discuss it with staff. Unfortunately, at this time, we didn't have the necessary ridership forecasts and future capacity needs identified in the form that was required under the Act. It is something that the staff could decide to come back once they have that developed, and it could be included as an amendment to the development charges and added in if you want at some point in the future. If at some point in the 5-year term of the bylaw you do choose to include that in, even though you're amending your bylaw, it doesn't open up the whole bylaw for an appeal. It only opens up the component regarding the transit itself for the DC appeal period.
Sorry, Ms. Neal, just to let you know, we're getting close to the 25-minute mark. I don't know if we can move it a little bit quicker along, please, because I know you're going to have lots of questions on this.
Sure, I'll try and move quicker. The ineligible services, like I said, solid waste is the only thing that has now been changed a bit, or waste management. Area-specific charges are now required to be considered as part of the calculations. We did back in January come forward to the task force to discuss whether or not area rating was going to be included, and it was decided that the calculations to move forward would be best to stay on a region-wide basis. With water and wastewater, of course, it would only be on the urban serviced areas that those two charges would be implied. As I said, the asset management is now a requirement as Bill 73, and we have included that in the background study and identified the impacts of that on all the projects that have been included in the background study. We've talked about no additional levies and the extended public process. There was also updates regarding the annual report of the treasurer that requires a little more reporting for more transparency for the development community. So the impact on Niagara, like I said, is really the area rating consideration, the local service policy update that is required to ensure that the no additional levies clause doesn't prohibit you from collecting what's needed in the future. So the growth forecast that we're looking at, again, is based on the MCR work and is set out. We've included both the 10-year forecast and the 25-year forecast. This sets it out graphically as well as in the black on the left columns, historic 10 years as to where the development has been. I know it's small and difficult to see, but as a high level, the forecast for the 10 years that we're looking at for the region, there will be a net population increase of almost 48,000 people, which is just over 24,000 units, and an additional 10.6 million square feet of non-residential floor area. For the 25-year build-out period, we're looking at 153,000 people, which equals just over 65,000 units and 31.6 million square feet almost of non-residential space. For water and wastewater, there's slightly less in there because of the areas that don't receive those services. We did include in the review all of the services that are currently in your DC right now: water, wastewater, roads, police, EMS, and general government, which are the studies related to those services. And we also, this time around, have included the roads or services related to a highway. We've included the facilities and vehicles related to that this time. Health facilities, social services, long-term care facilities, your POA facilities, social housing, and waste diversion. Waste diversion was due to Bill 73, so this is the first time it could be included. Very high level, what that entails is with all the capital that has been identified, there is a gross capital amount of $2.4 billion that's in here. When we do all the deductions, reductions, post-period benefit deductions, etc., we are including in the calculations $1.1 billion. This is a enhanced capital program based on service standards, and that was included based on discussions at the April 11th DC task force meeting. The proposed exemptions that we've laid out include full exemptions for granny flats, parking structures, non-residential lands and buildings for agriculture, used for agricultural uses, places of worship, any buildings or lands intended for use by municipal housing facilities, the proportionate share of lands and buildings used for affordable housing projects, gas canopies, and then there's also been other policy considerations. Indexing, we have moved to a January 1st indexing date, and that is something that with all the local municipalities, staff agreed that when coming forward in the future years with their bylaws, they will all try and move to the January 1st deadline, and that is really for ease of administration to ensure that there isn't multiple different indexing dates between the municipalities. At this time, we have not included phasing in of the rates. However, that is something that Council will consider. Exemptions and discounts are there as I've outlined. The calculation and timing of collection, we've agreed with the local municipalities to keep that at the time of the first building permit issuance. You are allowed by the Act for water, wastewater, and roads to collect at the development agreement stage, but we have agreed to stay with the building permit issuance date for the collection of the regional DCs. And there is a bit of a transition that's included in Schedule E of the bylaw, which we will chat about in a minute. So some of the updates to the draft bylaw include the definition of agricultural, which now defines bona fide farming purposes and excludes marijuana production facilities.
Chair, a point of order, if you don't mind. We're 35 pages into 55 pages. I appreciate your support. If you can just highlight it, please, because we're going to be spending 45 to an hour on this. And I'm not trying to be rude to you, please, but we can read some of these things. If anybody disagrees with me, challenge me on it. Thank you.
Councillor Gale, technically not a point of order. Ms. Neal, if you could be cognizant of the time, please, and proceed through with the rest of the presentation.
Sure.
Thank you.
We've had some refinements to definitions on the brownfield, the apartment units for residential, as well as the 50% expansion exemption for industrial. The hotel motel category has now been removed. Other multiples have now been including an expanded definitions for different types of multiple dwelling units that are now coming forward in the development process. And then the special care, special dwelling unit rate has been updated. Those have required new definitions for the types of new multiple type units, as well for non-residential, wind turbines, and the live-work units, or the components related to either residential or non-residential, has been identified and refined. Again, the designation of services have been updated. The exemptions for adult agricultural has been refined in the body. There's also a partial exemption for 50% of long-term care homes, and rules regarding the industrial has been updated. For conversions, the wording has now been changed to include what previous both agricultural and institutional uses are. Demolition credits as well has been refined to allow for those previous uses, and the indexing changed. Schedule D refers to rules with respect to brownfield developments located within urban areas for the regional development charge reductions. There's quite a bit of changes to this as to where, with the major being that the exemption will no longer be any more than what the cost of remediation is for the brownfield sites, and that is to make sure that brownfield developments have the same ability to be on the same playing ground as any other development, so that those costs will be deducted from the DCs. Again, with Schedule E, it is respect to development located within the designated exemption areas and brownfields within all urban areas of the regional development charges. So I'll let you skim through those. There are some new categories included in residential, so singles and semi-detached are included as one category. There are now 3 categories for apartments, bachelor 1 bedrooms, the 2 and 3 bedrooms, and 4 bedroom plus. Other multiples, and then on a per room or unit basis, the special care, special dwelling facilities. Non-residential, we are now with industrial, commercial, institutional, and wind turbines. The level of service ceiling that I was talking about, you can see through this table that for the most part, other than the services related to a highway and their related vehicles and equipment, we have pretty much included the maximum amounts allowable under the development charges calculations for all of the other services. That results in this enhanced capital program that we have in here, which comes out to a calculated charge, if you're in the urban areas, of $19,006 per single family home. Those charges are reduced for other types of residential units. And then for non-residential, it comes out to a charge of $11.41 per square foot for commercial, $4.73 per square foot for industrial, and $8.15 per square foot for institutional. Wind turbines is on a per wind turbine basis, and it is $7,371. If we were to back off the additional provisions that we made to come up with closer to the service standard calculations, which basically ensures that you don't reduce your service levels that you currently have. But if we were to back off some of those provisions, the non-enhanced DC calculations would bring that single-family charge from the $19,000 down to $15,544, and it would reduce your non-residential charges accordingly. As a comparison, so you can see where you're at, with the calculated enhanced program, there is about a $8,500 increase in where your charges are today. $4,436 of that relates to services that you already currently have in your background or your current bylaw, and $4,087 of that is related to services that we're introducing this time around for the first time. Again, with the non-enhanced, that is a slightly less increase, obviously. Instead of, it would just be over $5,000. For non-residential, as a comparison, again, the calculated enhanced program is actually for commercial in either the calculated or enhanced. The enhanced or non-enhanced capital program, there is a reduction in the overall charges for commercial. There is also a reduction for industrial, and but there is an increase for institutional. To give you a comparison of where the enhanced capital program lies, as you don't want to go through the comparisons? Okay, that's fine then. I would be happy to answer any
I'm sure
questions.
that all council members will be diving into those comparisons on their own time. Thank you, Ms. Neal. I'll give you a chance to summarize the next steps, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah. So going forward, you are going to be meeting on May 30th regarding the transportation master plan and the water wastewater master plan. We don't anticipate any major changes that would be required to change the capital program that we've included based on those services. However, if something was to come forward based on any decisions made there, and that requires a change to the development charges study, we would have to do an addendum to the report that is out there, and that could still come forward within the timeframes that we have now. We could revise the draft calculations in the bylaw, and that's what we would bring forward to the public meeting then on June 8th. And then it is planned that council will consider the bylaw on June 29th. And there is right now an anticipation of the effective date of the bylaw still being September 1st, as your current bylaw expires August 31st. All right.
Thank you very much, Ms. Neal. I know this is a pretty important discussion, and the extra time I think is necessary for us to digest and understand what is being proposed. It's one of the biggest decisions we make as a council with respect to development charges and how that impacts our economic growth in the region. I see a speakers list is formed throughout the presentation, so I'll turn to Councillor Valpatti for the first.
Thank you. I have a few items, but I'll try to move through them quickly, Chair. And thank you for the presentation. First of all, software and hardware, you mentioned something about that as it relates to water, wastewater. Are any of those eligible?
They are eligible, yes.
Including software?
If it's required and integral to the provision of the service, then yes, it's
Okay,
included.
so we've just spent something like $15 million on a new EFMS system, software system for the region, which really, we needed it because of growth. Would that be eligible for?
We could look at it, yes, although
Okay.
I don't believe that's been included.
Well, might be worth looking at. Any move by the province to include hospitals?
No.
There isn't. And they're infrastructure heavy, but no, okay. We can't charge future growth any more than the average of the last 10 years. And we've had this huge increase in development in real estate. So how do you square those two things? Where are we going to provide capital for this increase if we have to rely on the last 10 years where we didn't have any growth or very little growth? Through you, Chair.
Yeah, the service standards that we look at for the historic, unfortunately, if you have been growing over the past 10 years and you haven't been putting new infrastructure in place to keep steady with that growth, it does limit your service standards. So you can actually have declining service standards over time. So because you look at those costs over and those historic quantity and quality measures over your population for each of those 10 years and take that average. As your population increases, if you don't provide the service to keep pace with that, because your numerator of the quantity and quality of the service is used in the calculation, the population being the denominator, you can actually have decreasing service standards. And that is part of why we put in the enhanced capital program, because without that, you are not staying pace with the anticipated growth to come in keeping the current average service standard you have today. The non-enhanced capital program will result in a decline of that service standard you provide today.
So the enhanced recommendation that you are making will ensure that we won't be caught short in the next 10 years?
That's right. Well, it's actually the 10 years and the 25-year
Right, for both.
period for the services that go past the 10 years.
Okay, and the rates you're now recommending, is there any room for us to increase those rates?
Not over the enhanced program at this point, no.
There's no room in residential or commercial or anywhere?
No, we have...
We're at our maximum. You've recommended the maximum in all cases.
The only area that is left is your service standard for the roads and related, or the services related to a highway. You have a very high service standard there. And that is the only service that we did not max out on. If I can quickly go back to that slide and show you, there it is there. And I know it's hard to see, but it is, if I can find it in here, slide 47.
Yes.
There is still left on the table almost $593 million in the service standard for that one. That is really the only area that we could increase more on.
So how much would that mean for a single-family residence? And I don't know if you have to provide me these answers now, though. That's a question I'd like answered, though, at some point.
Yeah, we can report back to you.
All right.
On that.
So, and transit we haven't included because we're in the process. And we don't have to reopen the whole bylaw, just that portion of the bylaw.
That's right. You could even pass a separate bylaw that just relates to transit, or you can amend this bylaw to add that service in.
Is there any other issue other than transit which can be treated in the same way?
No, we've included all other services that are eligible that the region provides.
So transit is the only one?
Right.
And hotel and motels, sorry.
No, that's okay.
People will be happy to know I can't talk too much today. Hotel and motels have been removed. What does that mean?
There was on the non-residential charge the charges you have currently in place. There's industrial, commercial, institutional, and a hotel motel. It's my understanding that that category was put in place for mostly for Niagara Falls. And in discussions with the local area municipalities and looking at the past, there was only about $50,000 that have been collected over the last 5 years under that rate, and they didn't feel that it was a significant amount of development in that area to include or to continue including a separate rate for that. In discussions with the municipalities and trying to come up with alignment, most municipalities or the locals here only have one charge for non-residential. They don't split their non-residential charges by different types, and we're looking to try and get the region to decrease the number of categories to make it easier administratively in applying the bylaws and trying to determine where some developments lie, or if there's a split type where you could be partially industrial, partially commercial. They were trying to get us to reduce even more
the categories.
Unfortunately, the only one we were able to reduce was the hotel motel, and because it had the least impact.
So just to clarify, through you, Chair, I can't go back to Niagara Falls and tell hotels and motels they're exempt from DCs.
That they weren't exempt previously
Just-
either.
I understand.
Yeah, no, they weren't exempt in the past.
And
They
my
just had a
last
slightly
question is
different
this:
rate.
with the real estate boom that we're seeing in Southern Ontario, and that puts real pressure on the rental housing market because people don't want to build rental. Are there any incentives that you know of that other municipalities are doing to encourage the build of rental units that we might be able to contemplate?
There are some municipalities that are allowing for deferral agreements to basically spread out the time period in which the development of those rental units have to pay the development charges on. The Act states, as well as your bylaw, that you can enter into an agreement with a development for either early or late payment. That is allowed already under the Act, so quite often municipalities, for those type of units to get them going, will say that they can pay their charges over a number of years through those agreements. I don't know of any that actually that exempt rental units or do specific reductions of the charge, where they may say, you know, you could say 50% of the charge would be imposed, but or any other percentage. I don't know any specific to that, but I do know that there are a few that offer those type of developments deferral agreements, and that allows the development then to start gaining the revenue to be able to pay those.
So there's no other incentives that have been used?
Not that I'm aware of.
Have you looked in, sorry, through you, Chair, have you looked into that? I mean,
Yeah.
is that a,
We did look into that. We keep a survey pretty up to date of almost all the bylaws that are in place in Ontario. And we did go back and look at, for all of those that we have, what was there. And again, the only thing that we could see was that
the deferral?
the deferral agreements. Yeah.
And that has been used, actually?
Yes, it has been.
Okay, can you perhaps provide us with where it's been done? Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Volpatti. Councillor Height, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Through to the presenter, back to the exemptions. Are you suggesting that there aren't exemptions in other communities? Because they've come forward, groups and organizations here regularly, not regularly, but on occasion, and asked for exemptions for DC charges, and this council has voted to exempt them from time to time.
That any exemption or discount outside of the mandatory ones in the Act are solely at the discretion of each individual council. So there may be occasions where someone has brought something forward to a council and the council has voted to reduce or exempt any one type of particular development. And unfortunately, if it is something that is done that isn't necessarily in their bylaw, I wouldn't always know about that.
Okay, and if we do that through to the presenter, and we in 1 year say, let's waive $1 million worth of DC charges, can we then add that $1 million to the number that's required and then charge everyone more?
No, that's cross-subsidization. Any amount that is non-collected because of exemptions, reductions, have to be funded from other sources, which means your taxes and or rates for the water wastewater components.
Thank you. Another question, I have a few. You mentioned minimum size pipe. I think you said that, and that disturbs me because if we're planning for 10 to 25 years, we don't want to put in that minimum size pipe in case there's going to be future growth, and then we have to dig up the road, and the taxpayers go crazy saying, what are you doing this for? You just built it.
Yeah, where I was talking about the minimum size pipes is in that local service policy. So if someone comes forward with a subdivision, for example, they would be required through their subdivision agreement to put in the local roads and sidewalks, street lights, all of that, including the, say, water and wastewater and stormwater mains that may be under 300 millimeters, that are all the locals. The broader sized pipes that are needed for the transmission mains and the trunk sewers and all of that are quite a bit bigger, and that are sized through the master plan that's underway to service all of this growth. Those are all in the development charges. We just want to be clear as to, in the local service policy, what the developer is required to do as part of their subdivision agreement, and then what would go into the DC. And it's those bigger type pipes that go into the development charge, because they're serving more than just one specific development.
Okay. And thank you, through you to the presenter. You spoke also as there's a way of, I don't want to say necessarily beating the system, but if you had a unit and you added one, it's exempt. So I add one this year, and then next year I add another, and then the year after I add another. Every year, are they exempt, or is it one on a property?
Well, no, it's per unit. So if I have a single-family home and I want to convert my basement into an apartment, I'm not more than doubling the size of my home. I don't have to pay for that apartment. If the next year I have my single-family home and I want to change my second floor into yet another apartment, I can do that, because that's 2 units. If for some reason I wanted to then add on and put a 3rd unit over top of my garage, I would be paying a development charge on that,
Even
because
though it's
I'm
5
only
years?
allowed 2
Okay.
units in a single family. Any other type of residential unit, I'm only allowed 1 additional unit without having to pay the DC. So it's to help with the intensification, but you can't start with I'm going to build a 500 square foot home, and then I'm going to come back next year and I'm going to build another 500 or 600 unit on top of that, and keep coming back. And that's why the Act states that you can't more than double the size of the current home when you add these units.
So it's current today.
Current today.
Through you to the presenter, on a question about a property that's 10,000 square feet, and I happened to see one the other day because someone asked me to go by. It's going to be a tear down, there's no question about it, and someone's going to build, so they need the square footage of that property today, tear down the property, and then they're exempt for 10,000 square feet, if that's
For
what the size is.
non-residential?
For residential.
For residential, it's based on a unit. So if I
Okay.
tear down a single family home and I build 4 townhouses, I would get 4 times the multiple rate, less 1 times the single family rate.
Okay.
And I'd pay the net incremental increase.
So tear down a house and you build a monster house, there are no development charges?
There's no development charges.
Okay. Through to the presenter, you mentioned that there is nothing in here for transit, but we subsidize and have a specialized transit system. That's not included?
It is not at this time, because we didn't have the information on the future ridership needs that are required under the new Bill 73 components of the Development Charges Act, which are very prescriptive as to what you have to identify. And so that's something that a transportation or transit engineer would have to be involved in doing to be able to provide us with what we need to go forward with a charge on that.
But we've been running specialized transit for 5 to 7 years, I think now, in that range. 2006.
It is something that staff are aware of, and maybe looking into getting the information required as a separate process from this, so that you could review and look at what you may include as a charge.
Okay. 2 other questions through to the presenter. You spoke about grants that you sort of can't double dip.
That's
You
right.
can't collect and no, but in a lot of cases, the federal and provincial government say, oh, by the way, there's a grant today for the next 6 months, apply, and we don't know that.
That's right.
So when we're doing this, we aren't aware of grants tomorrow that are going to be.
Absolutely. Where we have included some assumptions on grant subsidies or other contributions are on highway interchanges, where there's quite often a sharing with the local municipalities, the regional municipality, and the province. Anywhere else, unless something was already in hand, we have not included that. However, going forward, If were successful in getting a grant, say you have $1 million project and you're successful in getting $250,000 worth of a grant in that in the future, when going forward to fund the capital project, you would recalculate the amount of development charges you'd fund for that by taking that deduction first of the grant and netting it off, and then only funding the balance proportionately for growth or any benefit to existing. So this is our best estimate based on everything we know today. Not to say that some of these projects that are budgeted won't come in above or below what the estimate is, or that there may be other funding sources that come along that you can certainly do. It's up to your finance department to then make the appropriate adjustments to the actual amount funded out of development charges. And then with every 5-year update, we look at where things are, including where your current development charge reserve funds are. And if there's a balance in the reserve fund, we deduct that from what's needed to go forward. So in a case like that, you'd have $250,000 that you thought you were going to need from development charges that you wouldn't need. So there'd be a bit of a surplus then in the reserve fund. We would deduct that out of the calculations going forward. So that is part of why the 5-year term of the bylaw is the max, to make sure that all of those updates are taking place. This is also our best estimate of the projects that you need today, depending on how growth happens and where it happens and the type of growth that actually comes forward. A project may change in scope. Where you thought you might need a 500 millimeter pipe, you may need a 700 millimeter pipe because it's a higher, apartments and stuff. So again, this is based on all the best knowledge today. And as staff come forward annually with your budget, they'll be reporting on how much of the projects are growth related. And there is a part of the recommendation of the background study is that the project listing that's set out in here is approved by council with the understanding that there will be an annual review through your budget process of the actual capital projects that go forward to service growth. Okay.
Last question. And probably one of the most important. Yesterday, we were at social services, and we know how desperately we need housing, social housing, low-income housing. In the enhanced program, am I looking at now a way of collecting 2/3 through DC charges? Or exempting 2/3? Or exempting none? Because it suggests not, and then it does
For
suggest
social housing
yes.
that the region provides, there are 2 specific projects that have been identified as capital projects over the next few years that are going forward. And then we also looked at what your current service standard is and provided an additional amount to come up to that service standard. So there's a capital provision amount made in there
Of
that does not at the moment have a specific project related to it, but we assume that over the 10-year period, those projects will come forward and be identified for a specific location and type of number of units.
Is that the $966 per capita that I'm looking at on this chart? Is that what you're talking about?
That is what, yes, that is the, let me
Level
just
of
find
service
it,
ceiling.
social housing.
$966 per capita cost.
No.
Well,
No, sorry, the social housing is $2,123 per single-family home.
okay. I was looking at a different chart. I was trying to get what number we're talking about.
If you go to slide 48,
Okay, I was looking at 47 where I saw 966 cost per capita.
the
On that,
960,
On page 47.
page 40.
I was trying to get an explanation
Oh,
of
sorry,
what that is.
that's your service standard cap right now. So we're trying, that's that 10-year historic service standard, and that's what we are trying to continue with to make sure you don't drop below that, because we can't increase, you may need more than that, but we can't get it through the development charges for you. We can only get you to stay on par with that. And we've put the capital allowable into the background study to ensure you stay at that cost per capita.
And that's max.
That's max.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Height. Great questions. Councillor Burrows?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. Very informative. Just a couple of questions. Where we, and it says on page 5, to recover the capital costs associated with residential and non-residential growth within the region. That's perfectly clear. What I'm wondering is that where we provide exemptions, and you've said that we must fund that out of
Other sources.
operations.
Yep.
Okay, so that's good, but tell me something, in the Act, are we required, when there's a request for relief on an individual case, and they come up all the time, are we required to give 100% relief? We have a history here, if you ask for it, you get 100%. And it always, to me, a 50% would be a great bonus, and I assumed it was the Act told us it was either in or out.
No, other than those mandatory exemptions, anything else is discretionary.
Yeah,
And you
discretionary.
can exempt or reduce you can give them a 1% reduction, you could give them up to 100% reduction.
Thank you.
You can give them nothing.
That's great, and my only, there's been several questions answered already. My other one is on transit, both intermunicipal and the GO that's coming, and the huge investment that we're making and will be making on the capital side. I know we're spending money on other things. That's not in here. I don't understand. I realize you don't have any data and all of those things, but it's going to be a major operation in the next 5 years, and yet we're not covering it at all.
Not at the moment.
No, and you said that a couple of times on other issues, not at the moment.
No,
But when is the moment?
well, I'm not sure what, through staff, they may be able to help as to what, I mean, a lot of it will be direction from yourselves to staff to undertake the necessary means to get the information required to be able to include it as a development charge going forward.
But I thought this is quite a progressive look at the next several years, but you're leaving out a number of key issues.
We're leaving out transit because we don't have the information on the future ridership forecasts that we require to do the calculation. And that is the piece that's missing. And that is something that, by all means, council can have, direct staff to get that information in place so we can come back and include that charge. And that can be done over a few months, really.
Yeah.
There would have to be another public process to come back and add that into the DC, but it is entirely your discretion to get staff underway with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Burrows, Commissioner Burgess just want to comment to that, provide some further information.
Through the chair, Councillor Burrows, I think once we figure out what the governance is and who's operating intermunicipal transit, and if we are the operator or we're a funder and how that rolls out, that will impact how we'll decide whether we're going to amend the DC policy at that time. So if we become the operator of that service, then we would then take a look at what's the DC impact and do an amended policy. But there's just too many questions at this point in time.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess my concern is that we don't do this DC update all the time, and if we are about to amend it, then there's another whole public process we have to go through. And so I'm just sort of wondering why we aren't making some best estimates of the effect of transit in the future of the Niagara region.
The biggest issue, if we're not the operator, we can't charge DC for it, so we have to determine that question first. The bylaw comes up every 5 years, and we can, but at the interim, if there's frankly enough money on the table, I will gladly hold the public process to amend the bylaw. That's not an issue for me.
So our pilot project doesn't count for all this for the last.
That's correct, at this point in time.
Thank you, Councilor Burrows. Councilor Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the presentation. I do have some questions. To build on the questions that Councilor Volpatti asked about apartments, affordable housing, etc. My understanding is that this is actually going up a considerable amount. Can we just hear that number? I didn't see it here in the presentation. Can we hear the difference between, and I'm trying to find that here. Maybe it is, I have it on a Schedule C, Schedule of Development Charges, but how does that compare in, with apartments? Can we just hear more about that, Mr. Chair?
Through the presenter.
The charges for affordable housing, so if someone was coming forward with an affordable housing, at the moment, we have a 50% reduction of the charge. So the calculated charges you see, if they were coming forward with I'll just go back. If they were coming forward with a development that included apartment units that were affordable units, then they would get 50% of a reduction on the rate for the size of the apartment. So if it was a 2-3 bedroom apartment, it would be 50% of the charge that is calculated.
Okay.
So just if you want to.
So how do those, that's fine. What about other apartments? We're talking about density, etc. So how does that charge, as I read it here, a 4-bedroom, 22,000, 2 to 3 bedrooms, 10,000, 1 bedroom, 6,500.
Yeah, so that's on a per unit basis.
And how does that compare to what we're at currently?
How does that compare?
How does that compare to what we're at currently?
Oh,
I didn't see that.
Just a procedural issue. Questions through the chair.
Sorry.
I'm allowing the leeway with the conversation between the presenter, but through the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, I'm wondering how that compares to what we're currently charging.
Through the chair, I don't have off the top of my head what your current apartment rate is, but we could certainly provide that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if we can provide that for Councilor Augustine.
Yeah.
I don't know if staff has that
Thank
number.
you. Mr. Chair, I've heard some concern in the community about that and wondering what the impact would be on new apartment units. The other piece about units, Mr. Chair, there's also incentives in the downtown areas. So we heard earlier that, again, if somebody wants to make an apartment in the downtown, they can still use the incentives, and that's outlined in the draft bylaw. Is that how that's done as well?
Through the chair, yes, there is still in Schedule D and E of the bylaw those incentives in the designated urban. Well, there's the urban areas, and then there's the designated exemption areas that still have those incentives.
Okay, thank you. The interesting one that I saw there was stormwater, Mr. Chair, and I wondered how that compared to the local servicing policy. So somebody comes in with a greenfield development, they're putting in a stormwater pond, and yet stormwater is allowed for the growth component as opposed to the local's servicing policy. Can we just hear a little bit about how that functions?
Yeah, through the chair. The stormwater is an interesting one. With any other service, you can put as a policy in your local service policy to say that it's a responsibility of the developer, or you could include it in the development charge. So the stormwater pond, for example, could be the requirement of the developer to just put in place on their own. And that's probably 95% of municipalities have it as a local service. It's a requirement through the development agreement to put in place. There are some municipalities that include those ponds in the development charge, such as Hamilton. And quite often where we see those facilities being included in the DC is because of fragmented development where you may need one pond to service 8 different subdivisions. And so it's a little more difficult to get one developer to put it in there when really it benefits multiple developments. So quite often if it's a local service policy, the developers will work together and come up with a cost-sharing agreement on their own for that pond. But in some cases, the municipalities choose to put it in the DC and then they can administer it and make sure that everyone's paying the fair share through the development charges. So it really comes down to policy. Do you want it as a local service or do you want it in the development charge? I believe most of the municipalities here in Niagara have it as a local service and don't include it in their DCs.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer, but just want to tease that out a little bit. So if we're building a new EMS station or a new police or whatever it is, and there's a requirement for a storm pond for that service, which is growth related, then that's included in the calculation. Is that correct?
Through the chair, yes. Anything to develop that new facility, including the cost of the land and all of that, would be part of the capital project for that.
And then, so what about the roads component, Mr. Chair? Do we know that piece? So you're the road right now is a 2-lane cow patch. Now we have to expand it to a 4-lane because of growth in the community, and as a requirement of that, there's a storm pond that's there and it has to be upsized. Do we know whether that's included? I don't know if the presenter knows that or if staff know that.
I would have to defer to the engineering staff or I believe Chris Hamill's here from GM Blue Plan, and he may be able to respond to that. I'm not sure of every single cost.
Mr. Chair, we don't need it right now. But maybe if it's something.
Commissioner Tripp was willing to answer right now, but we can get that information if you want.
Mr. Tripp. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, in a similar way that was described with the development scenario, the costs related to the growth infrastructure would also be eligible in that calculation. We just go through the process of determining what is benefit to existing and what is attributed to growth.
Okay, great, thank you. And so then what about the active transportation component? I note on page 11 of the bylaw that it's not necessarily included. Transit isn't there, as we talked about, but cycling isn't there, stormwater's not there. Does that need to be included in the definition? And is that type of structure included in the roads, highways component?
Through your chair, yes, it is. We have defined in the local service policy what is included as a services or services related to a highway. So any of your active transportation, your street lighting, your sidewalk, everything has been included in the definition of that. So if it is something that is included in a project that would be considered a local responsibility, then it is. If it is something in that definition that is the higher order projects, that would be included in the development charges in the projects that have come forward through the transportation master plan. And there are quite a few active transportation projects included in the DC.
Okay, great. A question, again, we probably don't have the answer for this right now, Mr. Chair. We're forecasting the future. I recall 5 years ago when we were discussing the existing bylaw that there was some concern that we wouldn't attain the growth and that therefore the number was actually smaller or wasn't the right number to charge. Can we get a summary of how we compared to the growth? We have it in here, but we don't know what the forecast was and how it compares.
Councillor Augustine was asking if we could have a comparison of what we were told the forecast would have been 5 years ago and how we met or didn't meet that target in terms of whether the amount was the right amount chosen at that time for development charges.
If it's easy to attain. No, for the units, those kind of things.
No, I believe, Councillor Augustine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or if you want to rephrase it, but you were asking we said we would make so many single-family units, so much square footage 5 years ago to develop the price for the development charges 5 years ago. How did we meet on those targets?
How did we do?
Yeah.
So we budgeted 10,000 new homes, we only built 10, or we built 30? I just want to know how we did, that's all.
I think you're just asking for a comparison of what we said if we do 5 years ago.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, the final, I think, is about the, and this is raised under some of the correspondence, the agriculture, greenhouses, marijuana operations. Did this committee decide that we're going to do that? I know that we have a couple of letters saying that agriculture is agriculture, agriculture, and if somebody comes up and decides they want to grow something else, they should be able to do that under greenhouses. So, Mr. Chair, when's the time to talk about that, the marijuana operation? I know that some want to treat it as an industrial use, some want to treat it as an agricultural use.
Through you, Chair. That discussion is quite, this is the time. We do want to be able to go forward with recommendations at the public meeting and an updated draft bylaw if that's required to ensure that we are making, all of your concerns where you would like things to be available as soon as possible. There has been quite a bit of discussion with staff on this. With the development charges, we tend to, for the most part, look at built form. A lot of the marijuana facilities that have been coming forward in other municipalities are obviously recent, and you're not alone. There's, how these are going to be dealt with aren't specifically laid out in most or any municipal DC bylaws right now because they are so new, and most municipal bylaws were passed 4 or 5 years ago and didn't have this issue. So it is something that is new. It is up to the discretion of this council as to how you want to deal with them. We have had some municipalities that have come forward with, they've had application for these type of things that are in industrial type buildings in their industrial parks, and that's partly, hydroponics, security measures, etc. They have their, not only the growing, but the production and processing as all part of that facility. We would suggest in those cases that that's not agricultural, that it's no different than processing and producing any other type of medicine. However, if this council wishes to decide that if it's the growing part of it in a greenhouse is exempt, that is entirely up to your discretion. And there has been talking about the cultivation of it versus the processing and production of it. And we look to you for what you would like us to include in this draft bylaw. It was something that we wanted to bring forward and include in the bylaw, the draft bylaw now, to make it aware because we know it is a new issue.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Chair, just to that, if I can dip an oar in the water rather quickly, I know I've been a little long, but I think that would be the preference that from this council anyways, that it would be the growing is agriculture and the rest of it can be dealt with, whether it's the processing, etc. And I believe that would be consistent on how we normally currently treat greenhouses. So that's how we do it in the town. I see staff nodding their heads about what we're currently doing. There's a number of conversions going on, and I think it would be awkward. For example, there's one I know of, in our community. It'd be awkward. No, do we now have to, because they're converting from an existing greenhouse growing orchids to growing medical marijuana, do we now have to go and get the DC from them, etc.? So that would be the preference for myself. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Augustine. A very valid point with those changes to greenhouses, obviously affecting those areas that have lots of greenhouses, including my municipality of Grimsby as well. But something that, as I understand Councillor Augustine's question, we have the draft in front of us. Do we want to bring that, asking for a recommendation for this council to bring forward, or do you want to, at the time during the consultation, make that proposal? And I'm just wondering, sort of, to answer your question, the timing to do something like that.
through the chair, the way the bylaw is drafted right now is exactly as Councillor Mayor Augustine has in fact described. So the growth is deemed agricultural, the processing is industrial. That's consistent with how MPAC assesses it right now. So if there was an inclination on council's part to go in a different direction, that recommendation to us now would then facilitate us amending a bylaw to bring it back for discussion at the public meeting in a different fashion.
Okay, so Councillor Augustine, the current version is what you suggested. If you don't want to make any changes, we accept the current version unless you want to propose any changes different to that.
Okay, that's great. I didn't understand that from the presentation or the correspondence we received. I appreciate the clarity now. Thank you.
Okay, and sorry, if I can just ask a further question to follow up Councillor Augustine's for my own clarification. If you have an existing greenhouse and you change what's being grown inside an existing greenhouse, that wouldn't trigger development charges. It's only if you expanded or gone beyond the 50%, or how does that work? Or do you want to give me an answer? Change use might be a new assessment under MPAC.
Through the chair, if you are not going to exempt the growing in a greenhouse of that, then a conversion would really be from an agricultural use to another use. And you would have to determine whether that falls into the industrial category or whatever, and there would actually be a development charge then imposed, even though they're not expanding the square footage of the greenhouse.
Okay, so we'll have to, Councillor Augustine, you want to finish follow up with that? Because oh, sorry, Director Chamberlain just wants to follow up with that.
Yeah, just one more comment. The way it's worded in the DC background study is not exactly as we articulated, but the intention was there, so we will be making that revision. So I just want to be clear, if somebody were to read it and say it's not exactly the way I just expressed, that is in fact true, but we're cleaning up that wording so it is clear that the agricultural, the growth is agriculture and the processing is industrial. So we'll fix that for the final version of the bylaw.
That's perfect. I just pulled up the definition, and so it's not clear. So
yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And further to that, when that information comes forward, I know there's other municipalities, especially in southwestern Ontario, that have already gone through a lot of this conversion and processing with the greenhouse growers there for medicinal marijuana, so they might have some experience with what they chose to do as well. I don't know if you have any experience to provide us with some background on that. Don't need it right now, just when it comes up for discussion at the public meeting. Thank you. Councillor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. Certainly is a very comprehensive look, and I do consider a good deal of this to be quite progressive. I just want to clarify, the reliance on the growth numbers is pretty straightforward. However, growth is then validated through a variety of mechanisms, such as capital gaps, the sustainability plans that we have for our municipalities, asset management plans, all of those things. And there may be others that you considered at both the local and upper tier. My question, Mr. Chairman, is have we positioned ourselves well in those documents to enhance the calculations? Could we have done better? And a second part of that is what we do in terms of expressing ourselves and explaining exactly what our growth is, the impact of growth in our communities. Does that end up being part of the roll-up for the regional DCs then to be established?
Through the chair, the region has, through undertaking the municipal comprehensive review, taken a very detailed look at the growth that is anticipated in the region over the next 25 years. It has been extensively reviewed by regional council and continues to be. There is, I understand, it's not been fully completed and approved because there may be further refinements to it required based on additional information coming forward through the census data this year. However, we don't anticipate any change that's required to what we've included to service growth for any minor refinements that may take place through that process. But you have gone through a very extensive process when it comes to identifying the infrastructure required to service that growth, certainly by undertaking the Transportation Master Plan and the Water Wastewater Master Plans, they have been extensively looked at, reviewed, vetted through staff, and have been included in a very comprehensive way in the background study. The other services that we have looked at, we did expand looking at other eligible services that you've never collected in the past on through development charges to ensure that you are trying to get a full service growth-related charge in place. So I think this time around, by adding those additional services, it certainly helps the region deal with not just water, wastewater, roads, and police and EMS, but a lot of the other projects that you are feeling pressure on providing for growth. It certainly is now much more encompassing going forward with the additional services that we've added. So I think you've done a very good job of bringing forth what is the best way to deal with growth and service growth in Niagara region in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I also want to refer to the definition of agricultural use. I'm concerned about that being included in the bylaw, and I certainly want to know much more about that, as do other communities. There exists a very rigid confirmation process for farmers through other means. We don't need to create a new mechanism there at all, and I certainly want to make sure that and I'm looking particularly at the specific letter from the town of Fort Erie, where they definitely have a situation with horse farmers where they probably use much of what they grow for their animals, and therefore, may not meet that minimum gross income requirement. So I'm not sure what all is included in that, but I think this is a risk if we're not clear about what that definition is. And also the marijuana operations. I've certainly seen both the greenhouse application as well as the more industrial application. So again, this needs to be carefully vetted, and I'm not really sure, Mr. Chairman, how some of these things are going to be looked at. I mean, the same could be said about the brownfields. There's been a number of matters. So how are we going to revalidate them, or do the staff believe that this has already taken place at the community, at the local level?
Thank you, Councillor Easton. Ms. Neal, do you want to tackle that one, or do you want me to flip it over to staff?
I think maybe between the two of us, these are both definitions. The agricultural definition we have looked at and further refined. And there's a very slight minor change that may help. Where we've looked at having that agricultural number, it's and/or. You are assessed in the farmland tax assessment. So where a smaller, more type hobby farm may not be able to get that farm registration number, they may still have a portion of their property identified as farmland in the property tax class, and if that is the case, they would still get that agricultural exemption. So it's an and/or. You have to fall into one of those two categories at the moment. So that subtle difference may make all the difference in the world for those smaller type farms that you're concerned about. Again, with the marijuana, we're looking at refining it, dealing with the cultivating, growing versus the producing and processing, which we hope will then answer and make it a little easier and acceptable to all of you and the development community in those areas. If staff want to provide any additional.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to be clear about where in the process that will take place. Is that at the public meeting, or is there other side consultation going on with the sector?
We have an answer from staff for you, Councillor Easton.
Through the chair, Certainly, we've been processing all the information that's come forward through the public consultation. We've gone through the Regional Development Charge Task Force to get some feedback. That's why this is before this committee as well, is to incorporate any feedback from this committee. The public meeting, we will hear any further comments from the public, which council will have an opportunity to digest, process, and provide feedback as well. So at any of those stages, we are open to take any kind of feedback, do any further analysis, bring back any information so that we can meet the timely requirements of the bylaw expiry. So now's a good time as any, but certainly there's other opportunities for those who are not here. They'll have the public meeting as well on June 8th, I believe it is, to bring
Okay,
it forward.
that's fine. That's fine, Mr. Chairman. That satisfies my needs, and then I can do my own discussing, and then we'll see what the specific concerns are by the sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Easton. So much like Councillor Augustine's comments with respect to medicinal marijuana and yours with the agricultural definition, I think Ms. Neal is actually hearing this as well as staff, so it will be included in our discussions.
Right, and Mr. Chairman, there is an opportunity, I think there's a piece of that everyone needs to understand. So as the discussion goes forward, I mean, if you are not producing yourself and you have a tenant farmer or you lease your land, I mean, there's definitely different ways to do that. I just want to make sure that sometimes the fine points are the ones that end up creating the greatest amount of trouble, and I don't want to see that happen here. It's hard to go back.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councillor Easton. Good comments. Seeing nothing further from Councillor Easton, I'll turn to Councillor Nunziata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to be brief. I know this has been a very fulsome discussion to this point, so thank you to the presenter for presenting some of the details of the plan going forward. I want to commend certainly our staff for engaging our lower tier municipalities as far as how to bring language forward that may better suit their community. And I also want to congratulate my colleagues in Fort Erie. Specifically, have you seen the letter that the town of Fort Erie has responded with respect to some of the changes that they'd like to see?
Through the chair, yes, we've received a couple of letters from some of the lower tier municipalities. We are taking them under consideration. We are still discussing them with staff, and there may be, based on those, further refinements that come forward to the draft bylaw for the public meeting. And as Ms. Chamberlain indicated, that even after the public meeting, once we've heard comments from the public, there still may be more refinements that Council wants to direct staff to work into the bylaw, the draft bylaw that will come forward at the end of June for final approval. Up until that evening, you can still make whatever refinements to the bylaw you feel necessary.
Okay. Well, and I appreciate that answer, and I don't want to belabor the point, but through the chair, I think this really highlights that the bylaw as it stands right now in draft form, it's not a panacea for every community. So we do have some unique elements within our lower tier municipalities that need to be addressed within the language of the policy coming forward. Specifically, and I'll speak to Mayor Augustine and Mayor Easton's points, the definition. There can no longer be any ambiguity with respect to the term agricultural use, because as you see, it will have an impact on not only those farmers that don't meet that official definition, but from a Fort Erie racetrack perspective. I'm not going to bore this council with the details, but this is a racetrack that's under considerable threat right now, with policies that are being created unilaterally up at Woodbine with respect to stabling policies. We do not want to compound the issue of sustainability for this racetrack, for this very important facility of the town of Fort Erie, by compromising the ability of our farming community to do what they do best, which is to sustain the horse population. So again, very unique to Fort Erie. I would like to think that the language coming forward, there is no ambiguity. It is very, very specific, that it will allow this group of farmers to actually benefit. That's the one point. Through the chair to the presenter, when you look at some of the other opportunities coming forward, and for example, under the term of brownfield, and maybe Mr. Piccione, would speak to this during his delegation, but there are opportunities to redevelop lands inside the urban boundary, specifically golf courses. But again, knowing that there's a long history and a legacy of industrial use throughout many communities, there is an opportunity to apply brownfield designations on even open spaces. Again, going forward, and speaking again, very Fort Erie centric, there's a possible development, almost 1,000 units on a redevelopment opportunity at a golf course that's within the urban boundary. And this would further provide incentives if open spaces were included in that definition for brownfield. So maybe I'd just like to get the presenter's comments on that.
Through the chair, where the brownfield incentives right now sit in the policy, they are not just within the designated exemption areas, but they extend to all urban areas. So depending on where that open space is, if it's in an urban area, it's already encompassed in the lands that would benefit from any program that's identified in here for reductions that are available through brownfield redevelopment. If it's outside the urban areas right now, I believe that is the only time that it wouldn't be considered as part of the program. Staff can certainly correct me on that, but all brownfields in both urban areas and designated exemption areas are included in the program.
Thank you for that answer, but again, that segues into my next question, because we do have designated areas that are on the books and will be coming up very shortly that are not included in this. So for example, currently right now within the town of Fort Erie, we have the Bridgeburg area and we have the Ridgeway area. The Stevensville CIP area, which was just ratified, that's not included in this. We have two other CIP areas coming forward that aren't necessarily included in this. So to your point about if they're in here right now under the designated urban area, I agree with. But what about the opportunity of other designated urban areas coming forward that could take advantage of this program? If the policy as it states right now doesn't specifically speak to that, then there has to be flexibility in the policy to actually be nimble enough to include those areas.
Through the chair, there is wording in the bylaw that the development charge reduction program may be eliminated or modified as approved by regional council in the future. So if at some point a new area becomes part of those designated areas and regional council approves that those lands are now part of those designated areas, it then becomes part of the eligible lands under the reduction programs. So you have that ability to do that anytime.
Okay. Which is just a natural segue into my next question and my last question, Mr. Chair. Understanding that we need to be responsive and we need to be able to provide predictability to the investment community coming forward. When those new areas are identified by a lower tier municipality, does the region at this level act immediately to recognize them and respect them? Or is there another longer process to change the policy moving forward to include the new areas that have just been deemed appropriate by the lower tier municipality? And I think that speaks to one of the points that my colleagues in Fort Erie brought forward. Is it recognized immediately, or do we have to go through the whole process of changing the policy in order to recognize the lower tier municipality wishes?
Through the chair, and staff can certainly chime in on this as well. If it is something that is approved at the local level, I would think that through yourself and your other colleagues at the local level, you would want to advise the region that there has been a new area identified and approved as part of the local designated areas, and bring that forward as quickly as possible to regional council to consider amending and modifying the designated areas that are identified through this bylaw to include it. And that can happen as quickly as you can bring it forward and regional council can deal with it. Okay. I don't know what that process necessarily, how long that may take for yourselves.
I don't mean to laugh at your comment, but
sorry.
through staff, again, our commitment to the development and investment community is to provide predictability. So bringing forward the new information from the lower tier municipality, there needs to be some quantifiable time frame when this regional council will adopt that new element. And I guess that's what our partners in Fort Erie and certainly our other partners at lower tier municipalities are looking for. They're looking for concrete language. They're looking for predictability. So I'm hoping that all these comments are being taken in the fashion in which they've been brought forward, which is a collaborative effort to make sure that the unique situations presented by our lower tier municipalities are respected in the new policy. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Denzey, I would just have a quick response to that.
Through the chair, the region always works with the local area municipalities. This bylaw comes up every 5 years, and it's always a part of that. But anytime you look at designations and looking at stuff, there's budgetary implications and there's predictability issues for the region also. And it's we don't want to get into a situation where a municipality can essentially dictate the spending of regional money without any input from the region either. So collaboration has to work on both sides. Predictability has to work not only for the developers but also for the municipalities, because these are large budgetary considerations. You know, we are committed to growth, but there has to be that kind of balanced approach among all parties for when we're planning these programs out. And I think, so I'll speak on behalf of the CAO, there has been a Team Niagara team that's being developed with all the local area municipalities to discuss these issues in particular and make sure that everyone's on the same page going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Augustine, for a second and brief time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an unnatural transition, nothing we've talked about, and I appreciate the time. I'll be very, very quick. Page 12 of the draft bylaw talks about the chief building official of any local municipality shall issue a building permit with a development, but only if it's pursuant and payable to the bylaw. So it's essentially saying you can't issue the permit unless they pay the DC. I think we've had a situation like that. What's the teeth on that in the bylaw?
We're pointing to Commissioner Mustache to give you an answer.
Certainly, through you, Chair. There's a, generally speaking, at the local level, the chief building official is required to collect, as you said, the development charges prior to issuing the a building permit. There is the opportunity to defer the charges subject to an agreement, and that's usually how that's handled in the event that there's an expectation that the charge may change, or it's under dispute, or there's an inability to pay the full amount up front. It can be spread over a specified period of time by way of a deferral agreement.
Okay, so it has to be paid unless there's an agreement. So that's what number 3 is there, that section 38 of the Act, permit the owner perform work if there's an agreement. Okay, I just was thinking about a recent, I'll say within 5 years, occurrence of this. So, thank you.
Through the chair too. If there was a situation where for some reason the regional development charge and or the local development charge was not collected at the time of building permit, just in error for whatever reason, the Act does allow the municipality to add those charges onto the property taxes to recover them.
That's very good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Neal. Thank you very much for your presentation. Seeing no further speakers, we're going to move to delegations who want to comment on this presentation. Very informative. I know it was a long presentation and a long list of questions, but as I said, this is a pretty important issue, one of the most important issues that we set at the region. So thank you again. And at this time, I'd like to call Mr. Piccone to the stand for delegation number 1, please. On behalf of Lysani Homes. Oh, and sorry, Mr. Liskey is here as well. Is he wish? Okay. He's welcome to join us if he has any questions. Luke, 10 minutes, please.
We'll definitely try to stick to that. We will stick to that. Through the chair, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Luch Piccone, president of RCI Consulting. I'm here on behalf of Lysani Homes, along with Bill Liskey to my left here, who's the vice president and chief legal officer of Lysani Homes. I currently have 2 clients with active brownfield and smart growth development charge reduction applications, those being Lozani Homes and Mars Homes. So you'll be hearing from me after this on the Mars Homes application. So I have been discussing the transition policies as far as transitioning from the current DC bylaw to the new one and grandfathering of existing smart growth and brownfield DC reduction applications with regional staff since as far back as November. And I have received both verbally and in writing assurances from regional staff that the new DC bylaw would contain such policies. So when the draft DC bylaw was recently released, it does not contain any transition policies, and that's really predominantly what we're here to talk to you about. And in consultation with my clients, we felt it would be prudent to submit a letter requesting grandfathering under the existing rules. Now, to be clear, we're not here protesting the new rates. I'm sure there will be other delegations here that will do that. We are here to essentially discuss the 2 real key changes for my clients. One is the change to the brownfield DC reduction program from an automatic 50% reduction program to a program that provides a 100% reduction but caps that reduction at the costs of environmental remediation. And then the second change to the smart growth DC reduction program, it does not change the 50% DC reduction, but it does introduce wording which significantly reduces the ability of developers to rely on that program, including calling it an interim program, and then indicating that that program can be reduced or even eliminated by council without any amendment to the development charges bylaw. And knowing full well that regional staff will be reviewing the smart growth programs and the Smarter Niagara incentive programs within a few months, we do anticipate some major changes to that program. So that is why we submitted the request to be grandfathered. So as Bill will describe to you, Lozani Homes has relied on the development charge reductions, both brownfields and smart growth, as they currently exist and have existed in one form or another for the last 13 years in the DC bylaw. So this isn't something new. This has been around for a long, long time, and now it comes that recommendations to change the rules. So Lozani Homes has relied on these rules to acquire the site, to remediate the site, and as Bill will describe to you, remediation is well underway. The buildings have been demolished with the exception of one building. They are well into this huge project at a major gateway for Niagara that is going to create over 1,100 residential units at that site. And Bill will speak to the implications of that, both for the town of Grimsby and for the region. What does it mean for my client? Well, if these changes are implemented, it means at least a loss of $6 million in development charge reductions. And if you do away with the smart growth program, as much as $14.5 million. We're talking about a lot of money here. And we're talking about reductions that they are currently entitled to, that they have currently applied for, and the brownfields has been approved. We will be very shortly, hopefully seeing an approval for the smart growth. And basically, the remediation of this type of site with such significant costs, not just of remediation, but demolition and associated costs of infrastructure upgrading and so on, that decision has been predicated on the availability of these development charge reductions. So, going forward, it's really important that these reductions be maintained. I've spent the last 15 years analyzing, developing, applying for brownfield and smart growth incentive programs on behalf of developers. I've done most of the CIPs in Niagara, and I can tell you that over the last 15 years, in all and every cases, and not just in Niagara, everywhere else I've worked, if an application for incentive program, be it a tax increment grant, be it a development charge reduction grant, was approved by the municipality honored that commitment, even if they changed the program down the road. And that's really what we're asking for here, is that the municipality honor its commitment. Lozani Homes fully plans to honor its commitment to remediate the site and to develop it as a showcase smart growth site, and that's what we're asking for on behalf of Lozani Homes. I heard Councillor Nunziata say that, and I think he aptly stated that there can no longer be any ambiguity. A development charge is not a place for ambiguity. It's a place, as Councillor Nunziata said, our commitment to the development community is to provide predictability. That's what we're asking for here today. With that, I'll hand it over to Bill, and he will talk to you a little bit about the project itself and the impacts of the proposed changes. Bill?
Good morning through the chair, members of the committee. Thank you for letting me speak. I'll try to be very fast. I see the agenda is long, and I'll try not to be too boring also. I just want to briefly highlight brownfield development from a developer's perspective. And where I'm going with this is I'm going to say the DC program worked. I think the fifth wheel project is happening now, and it's going to be a great project because of the DC program that was in effect at the time when we purchased the property back in 2014. So just from a development perspective, it's an incentive. So looking forward, not back, we were incented into this because we don't know how long it's going to take to remediate the project. We don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know if it can be remediated. In many cases, there are areas or maybe even a whole site that can't be remediated to the table standards required by the Ministry of the Environment, in which case the money is wasted for purchasing the land. Also, when you purchase land that's environmentally contaminated and has groundwater contaminants, you inherit liabilities to neighboring landowners. In the case of Fifth Wheel, it's the region's water treatment facility, and it's the public beach recently constructed by the town of Grimsby. Now, there may not be percolating water going underground, but the perception of that in itself should be enough to incent Lizania Homes to get involved here, and we did. So, as Luciano said, cleanup operations are currently underway. The other thing is that there's a stigma to brownfield development. When you buy it, you have to convince people it's a great place to live, notwithstanding that traditionally it was a gas station and a truck stop. So that's another thing to overcome in buying and developing brownfield. And the last one, really significant one, I want the finance people to consider is that you can't finance brownfield. The banks don't want to lend to brownfield development. So it's an additional cost to having to self-finance. And in terms of getting investors to buy brownfield, that means they have to come in with millions and millions and millions of dollars of cash. So developers who don't have their own cash to self-finance are out of the game. So just please consider that as I go forward. The transitional rules in terms of incentive programs need to take into account when the stakeholders participate in the program, when did they make their contractual commitments to do what they were incented to do by the program, and when did they make their financial commitments to buy into the program. In the case of Lizania Homes, here's the story, and I can say this because my first task at Lizania Homes when I started in 2011 was buy the fifth wheel truck stop. So the problem was that the seller wanted full market price for the property, didn't want to give a long conditional period to examine the property, didn't want to give a vendor take-back mortgage, so there was no financing available for the property, and wanted no part in cleaning it up. So the polluter was selling the property, great piece of land, but dirty, as you can imagine. So overcoming those 5 obstacles, the liabilities, the not financing it, the timelines, and the unknown, what happened was, after many offers to purchase the land, in 2014, I went on the Region of Niagara's website and I found this fantastic brochure which was easy to read in point form that pointed out the program. And what it said was, if you qualify as a brownfield within a certain area, the 50% of the development charge payable to the Region of Niagara was not payable if it's a qualified program. So I reported to our owner, which is Fred Lizani, that this is the program and this is a great deal. And that's what made that offer almost unconditional, taking on the liabilities, self-financing close to $15 million purchase, full market value in my view, and we took on the project, and then we were self-financing the cleanup, all because of that program, the program which provided a risk-reward analysis that was beyond just reimbursement for the construction cost. It actually made the project viable from a risk standpoint, taking on the liabilities, taking on the self-financing. So please consider that. In terms of the benefits to the program, what you're seeing is the site being cleaned up. There's a tributary that runs through it. The groundwater conditions there are very important. The community, the town of Grimsby have a bunch of requests, including the waterfront trail, which will connect pedestrians. It'll beautify the site, as well as the liabilities of the cliff, which is quite steep. So getting a developer in there now, while the Winston neighborhood is growing, was really, really important because, as you can imagine, tractor trailers coming in off the Casablanca interchange was not consistent with the growing residential high-density neighborhood of the Winston area. So I guess what I'm saying is the region is, and the town and Liz Homes are all going to reap the benefits. We're asking that the region to consider the commitment that was made in 2014 and the metrics that were in play at that point are continued. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liskey. That's just over 10 minutes, and thank you for making your delegation. I see a speaker's list is formed, so I'll turn to Councillor Gale for first question.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to the speakers. Thank you for this, and I sympathize with you a lot. As you know, I was in the oil business. And anybody that's not in business, this whole council can relate to things like this. Thurl-Sona Montrose Road took me 17 years, and I killed it before my daughter bought the company because it took so long with permits and things like this. Now, I go to your first paragraph on the second page, and the last line of it, if I can read it, says, had Los Angeles Homes known that the region was going to change the rules of the DC reduction program, we would have submitted our DC reduction application long ago, rather than delay submission as we work to satisfy regional and town planning staff requests for revisions to the concept plan. That sums it up to me. Forget about everything else. So I'm in support of these gentlemen, unless somebody from staff or anybody can prove me wrong on this, because the time it takes, 5-year plans are out the window, but applications drive you nuts on this type of business, and I think you've done everything right, unless somebody can say something to the contrary. So I'm willing to forego this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Councillor Annunziata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through the presenters, Luch, thank you for your comments. And I know we worked together in 2007, 2008 in developing Fort Erie's and with Mr. Mustachi as well. Fort Erie's brownfield CIP. So specifically to your point, we have based a lot of marketing with respect to our economic development organization to put that out there as the carrot to attract investment. And when you keep changing the goal line, unfortunately, it sends a mixed signal into the investment community. So the collateral damage, from what I am perceiving, is investor confidence. That the language, if it isn't concrete, it's not going to provide the incentive that we think a brownfield CIP should. Is that correct?
Through the chair to the councillor, that is correct. And what you have to remember with brownfields in particular, there are so many uncertainties with these projects. The cost of cleanup, the cost of infrastructure upgrading, demolition, as I talked about. But furthermore, how much longer is it going to take you to get through the remediation and record of site condition process with the ministry? Unfortunately, that process is taking longer and longer. And so clients like Los Angeles Homes and Mars Homes who take on these projects need as much certainty as possible from municipalities that are offering these incentive programs to counteract the intrinsic uncertainty that goes with these projects. So you've hit the nail right on the head. It's about investor confidence and certainty in what is going to be available when 3-5 years down the road when it's supposed to be paid.
No, and I appreciate those comments through the chair. So just to highlight that point, I know the town of Fort Erie has had a brownfield CIP for probably a decade. I know the Mars development is the first one to actually utilize that project. We have another one, a smaller, more modest development, maybe 18 homes, that will take advantage of the brownfield CIP. So it does take time to nurture a program like that. And just because you have a program, there's no certainty that an investor will come in and assume the risk. And this council should be very, very, very well aware that brownfields, remediation, contaminated property, it all comes with uncertainty. We were dealing with the Central Avenue Bridge, and Mr. Tripp can speak to this, where the initial remediation spoke to, I think, maybe 3 tons, which eventually ended up to 300 tons, costing this regional council more money to fund the Central Avenue Bridge. So it's inherent that it's a very unpredictable science, and the predictability aspect is very, very vitally important. So I concur exactly with Mr. Piccion's comments. My last question, and you having been involved in brownfield CIP development for a long, long time, there is a comment from the town of Fort Erie that says, specifically when you're looking at the categories of brownfields, open spaces should be included within that language. Anytime that there is a EA phase 1 or a record of site condition that is a requirement of redevelopment or reuse, is that an appropriate opportunity to maybe see if there's a brownfield CIP that could be utilized in that particular area?
So through the chair, are we talking about open spaces that are contaminated as per the current environmental regulations? Or are we just talking about open spaces?
Well, right now, we're talking about a legacy of contamination throughout a lot of municipalities. And through some reason or another, maybe one has become a golf course. But without digging a little bit deeper and meeting the threshold of residential development, maybe if you dig a little bit deeper, you're going to find something that's there that no one knew about. So by virtue of making an environmental phase 1 a requirement and then having a need for a record of site condition, that in itself does not speak to the predictability of developing that particular open space into a residential threshold.
Okay, so through the chair, I don't know the particular details of the letter that was referred to. I glanced at it this morning. I didn't even have time to read it. The bottom line is that traditionally, brownfields were defined as former industrial or commercial sites. Now, we've seen in the United States and both here in Canada that that definition has now expanded to include all former uses. So, you know, there is absolutely no reason that you may, and this is something that a number of municipalities have dealt with, an institutional use. A lot of former institutional uses ended up being brownfields. And even some agricultural uses, because of the application of herbicides and pesticides, are now considered brownfields. Really, the definition comes down more to what is the current environmental status of the property, and does it meet the current standards? I think that is really where you get at whether or not a property is a brownfield. To do that, yes, you must conduct at least a phase 1 environmental site assessment, and more often than not a phase 2, to determine if that property can meet the environmental regulations for the proposed use. That's the other thing that's very important, okay? It may meet the regulations for the existing use, but not for the proposed use.
Okay, so to that point, I just want to make this very, very clear. Is the language within the policy right now, the draft policy right now, with respect to brownfield, could it be better? Could it be tightened up? Could there be less ambiguity with respect to what constitutes the definition of a brownfield? So to your point, where you see the definition evolving through our partners in the United States and certainly through some jurisdictions here in Canada, could we do a better job with tightening up the language of a brownfield with respect to our DC policy?
Again, through the chair, and I discussed this, we had a meeting yesterday with the regional finance and planning staff on this whole issue around grandfathering, but we did, as an aside, discuss some of the definitional issues and notional issues in the proposed DC bylaw, and I will tell you what I told them is that there is an opportunity to both refine the definition of brownfields and, just as importantly, define the definition of eligible cost. That is something that is currently missing from the DC bylaw. So it's not just to say this site is or is not a brownfield. It's also, if you're going to cap, now this is where it becomes important. If you're not going to cap, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to cap it at the remediation costs, then my professional opinion is that development charge bylaw has to define what is included in those remediation costs. Okay, right now, the reliance is entirely on the local municipalities, so you're going to end up with 12 different definitions of what's an eligible cost, and I don't think the investment community and the development community want that. Again, they want certainty, no ambiguity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Valpatti?
I was going to ask how much money this particular ask involved, but I don't think I need to know that. I think we need a full report coming back to, I guess, the DC committee as to how much money we're looking at in this case and in other cases that might also be, you know, in the hop at this point. And I really think that we need some wording for a bylaw, how to tighten it up so that these situations are taken care of, so that we can provide the certainty that we need. Am I clear in what I want?
I believe so, Councillor Valpatti, but I do understand that Schedule E of the bylaw will talk to transitioning issues, and I think that's what the presenter is looking to comment on, the transition issues.
So where are we with that?
But I'll just let staff.
Through the chair, we'll bring back a transition report, but to answer your specific questions as far as the financial implications, not just to this project, but to the other ones that are in the hopper, that will be part of a report going back to your committee on the 31st.
Okay.
This committee, sorry. It'll come back to Corporate Services Committee. On
in our next cycle?
On the next cycle.
Okay, so, and that'll be a complete report.
As complete as I can have it.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Councillor Valpatti. Councillor Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. I just have to ask, I believe right at the start, at least you said that you're here today to request a transition program. there'll be another day to discuss program changes. So we really should be focusing on your request to extend. I do know that I believe it was with the changes to the Smart Growth program a number of years ago. It became clear that their lands, I think they described it as within the built community, was being changed to lands designated under a local community improvement plan. And so the Beamsville Fairground redevelopment was caught in this exactly the same situation that you find yourselves in today. And I know that Regional Council brought forward the necessary transition plan. I think it was a 3-year, whatever it was that was required to ensure that commitments that had been made were honored. And I respect for all of the reasons that you've cited. And I think we should leave the discussion about the merits of changing the program to another day. And so that is my understanding, correct? Through you, Mr. Chair.
If I may, through the chair, if you have a look at the letter from Lozani Homes, it does both things. So our request, first of all, strongly encourages the region to preserve the current DC reduction for brownfields at 50% and 50% DC reduction for smart growth. Notwithstanding that, we anticipate there is going to be changes to that, and notwithstanding that there will be a transition policy, we will only have a few days to review that policy before it's back in front of you on May 31st, I believe it is. So notwithstanding that transition policy, regardless of what it looks like, please be very clear that on behalf of both Lozani Homes and Mars Homes, we are asking that both of those projects be grandfathered under the existing rules.
Thank you. That's what I thought the request was. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Hodgson. That's a good point. Councillor Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to that last point, Councillor Hodgson reminded us that there was this transition phase, that it was a 3-year phase, and then it kind of moved into the new, and that kind of happened seamlessly from what I understand, except for perhaps that one issue. And yet our presenter here, Mr. Chair, is asking for a grandfathering. Can we hear whether there's a time period on the grandfathering that they're proposing, or is it a grandfathering forever, et cetera? Obviously, this council would want the development to occur as quickly as possible. So can we hear from the presenter about the timing or the phasing of the grandfathering, how long that might be, et cetera?
I think that's a valid question, Councillor Augustine, because we did have one that previously had happened in St. Catharines.
Through the chair, that is certainly a very valid question. So I will speak to Mars Homes first, if I may. I have spoken with the president of Mars Homes, and they are at a point in their project, as you will hear shortly. They're about halfway through in terms of pulling permits and so on. And there's one mixed-use building that they will not be able to pull permits before August 31st, but they are confident and are willing to pull permits on that before the end of the next DC bylaw period. So in that case, it would be give us the next 5 years and we'll complete that. And Dan, that is what we discussed, right? In the case of Lozani Homes, again, we're talking about a project that in a best case scenario from where we are today will not see full build out for at least another 5 or 6 years, and likely more than that. It is 1,150 units. And I don't care how good times are over the next few years, that's a lot of units to be absorbed in Niagara, okay? So, and the idea is to do the project in 3 phases. So they cannot commit to 5 years. They want to see a longer time period, and we discussed this with staff yesterday. The 5 years just doesn't work for them.
Okay. When that comes back from staff, I think that's important for us to consider whether an exemption, the timing of the exemptions, et cetera. Thank you. Thanks.
And that's a good point. I think in the previous discussion we had a phased out of the development charges to encourage it to happen sooner rather than later, but they wouldn't lose it all in the totality. Thank you. Seeing no further questions to the presenter, I will ask you to stay at the podium and do your next delegation. With, Dan Gabriel of Mars Homes.
So I've said most of what I'm going to say, and I know time is precious, so I'm going to try to keep this very short. In the case of Mars Homes, both the brownfield and the smart growth DC reduction applications have been approved. They were approved back in January, so that's all done.
As with Lozani, Mars Homes based their acquisition, remediation, and redevelopment of this site in Fort Erie on the available brownfield and smart growth DC reduction programs that are in place right now. The impact of the proposed changes on their project, again, keeping in mind that it's a much smaller project, if both the brownfields and the DC reduction program, if the brownfields is capped and the smart growth program is eliminated, is just over $200,000 in additional development charges. So again, the commitment from the region is what was important here. And that's been provided. These applications have already been approved. There's nothing left to do. The remediation has in fact been completed and a record of site condition has been filed with the Ministry of Environment. Of the 59 residential units, they have already pulled permits and completed or are under construction on 31 of those units, and will pull permits on another 16. In this case, we're talking about one mixed-use building with 5,000 square feet of ground floor commercial and 12 units above. So to sum up, what's important in both of these applications is that the commitment from the region for these reductions must be firm. It cannot be ambiguous, it cannot be vague. And it must be firm when it is made. At the time of application or approval, which is different than what is being proposed, which is, you know, we'll make the commitment now, but pay it later and perhaps change the rules in between. That just simply does not work for my clients. So that, again, is why we're here requesting the exemptions. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan Gabriel from Mars Homes, who has a few words to say about the project. Dan?
Welcome, Mr. Gabriel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have my partner with me, Anthony Curella, Vice President Mars Homes, and we just came by today to briefly describe this scenario that we're facing. We first bought the property in 2007 and closed right about the time of the Great Recession, if you will. And since that time, have been working on developing the property. And as you can appreciate, that's basically almost a decade. And the good news is that the site has been cleaned up and the record of site condition has been issued, but that took a tremendous amount of time and effort to get to the point where we're at today. And we're in the home stretch now. We have homes under construction and everything's going incredibly well. But as you can appreciate, the recovery aspect of the investment of the cleanup is now to occur, if you will, and we're in that process. And really, for the rules to change at this point, well, that would be most unfair, as you can appreciate, right? We've started within a certain time frame of regulations and rules as for the cleanup bylaw goes, and we've completed that, and now we, if you will, need to settle up. And I'm looking forward to the continuation of the regulations as they were in place the day that we purchased the property and the day that we finished cleaning it up. It's been a tremendous project for us. We're very proud of it. It's been recognized at the Ontario Home Builders Association a couple years ago as the People's Choice Award. We were finalists last year at the Canadian Home Builders Association for the Community Redevelopment Award, top 4 in the country. So we're really happy with the development. It's been accepted readily by the home buying community, and I wish we had another 13 acres, but that's the way things go, I guess. And our situation is we've got a mixed-use building that we haven't had a chance to get to at this point because typically these kind of buildings have a commercial component, and as you can appreciate, you need to get all the people in first, and then they're the market for the commercial or office aspect that will be a significant part of this new building. So we hope that in the next 2 or 3 years that we will have the community built out and populated, and that should sustain the mixed-use building. So we ask for your consideration to our request to allow us the time to complete the development. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriel. Councillor Gale.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, I want to salute you guys for following the democratic process and coming in here and standing up and speak and airing out your stuff. But I'm going to ditto pretty well the same conversation I had last time. Again, I referred this time to paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 on page 2. And the last sentence in the, and I'll be very quick, the last sentence in the first paragraph, how can the region now justify potentially eliminating the DC reduction program for smart growth anytime after August 31st, 2017, and along with it, Mars Homes already approved 50% smart growth DC reduction for the balance of its units and commercial space in this development. I sympathize with you guys, but you came in, we're not wrong for what we did, but you're right for coming in and challenging it. So again, I support these guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Councillor Nunziata.
Yeah, just a quick comment through you, Chair, to the presenter. Thank you for choosing Fort Erie. I can vouch that Mars Homes have been excellent partners with the town of Fort Erie, and we're very, very happy with the product and certainly the quality of your workmanship. So on behalf of the entire region and certainly the town of Fort Erie, thank you for your commitment. Just a quick question to you. How important, when you did your pro formas, when you did your market research, when you did your breakout, your uptake levels, how important was to have the predictability at your disposal to, you know, craft the process going forward?
Well, it was instrumental for us. I think one of the things that you really don't appreciate is that when you get into these things, I think we're all optimistic by nature. What is the end result is far worse than what you had anticipated, if you will. And we would have never thought that we would be here, you know, just getting our record of site condition a month ago, just in time for people to actually move into the property. That was never imagined. And unfortunately, that's the scenarios that we encounter. So no matter how stable you see things, you need that stability, but it's still even, there's still a significant downslope from that level.
Thank you, Luch. Thank you, Mr. Gabriel. Seeing no further questions, I have a motion? No, okay, sorry. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Your comments have been heard, and I know when we talk about the transitioning process for the bylaws, your comments will be taken into consideration.
Through you, Chair, thank you to the committee. And I just want to make one final point. I have been where your staff are right now, making these difficult decisions, and it's about principles, it's about continuity, it is about certainty, it's also about money. And I do want to point out that in the case of the Lausanne Homes project, once that site is fully built out, it will create an additional annual property tax revenue to the region of about $2.5 million and to the town of about $2 million. So if there are certain council members who see this DC reduction as a loss, in fact, it can be easily repaid through those property tax revenues within a couple of years. So I wanted to make that point that these projects do have a payback for the municipality. And the payback can be very, very significant, both financial and otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to, we changed the agenda for items 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. Thanks, Councillor Edgar and Height for that. At this time, I'd ask for a mover, a second for receipt of the consent items for information. Can I get a mover? Councillor Height and Councillor Edgar. Any comments to the 4 consent items? Sorry, these are the correspondence items that were moved up, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. I believe they were discussed quite, a lot of the questions were asked to things. Are we about to lose quorum? Sandy, if you leave the room, we lose quorum. All right. Sorry, a question. Councillor Gale, yes, to one of the items.
Are you including 6.6 in your?
No, it's just 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. Seeing no speakers to those items, could I call the question? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That carries. Thank you. Item 5.1 is a time-sensitive issue with respect to the tax capping policy. Councillor Volpatti is moving receipt and adoption of item 5.1, CSD 24-2017, the 2017 tax capping policy. I have a seconder with Councillor Height. Are there any questions to that report? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Thank you. Item 5.2 is the CSD 37-2017, the unsolicited housing proposal from Pentair Group Limited. Do I have a mover for that report? Councillor Height moving the report. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Easton. Questions to the report? Councillor Volpatti.
And so I don't know how we can move the report, but anyway, let me go ahead with my questions, please.
Absolutely, Councillor Volpatti, and that maybe those questions will flesh out those options if we can see it.
I see that council provides staff with direction, right? So
Yes.
is that what we're moving, direction?
We'll be talking to that effect,
All
I
right.
believe.
We've had a similar proposal to this, I think the same proponents a few months ago that was approved by Niagara Regional Housing and I think approved by council. So my question is, how does this proposal differ from what we've already approved?
Commissioner Burgess.
Through the chair, the difference is what was previously approved by this council and by the board of NRH was a commitment to move people from the list to fill the proposed building. What this proposal is asking for is that the property that they actually build be deemed a municipal asset, and as such, under that essentially not have to pay property taxes or development charges that would be applicable to it.
For 99 years?
Yes, for the period of time that it's being used as social housing.
So it's a very much different proposal than what we've had.
It is a very much different proposal.
All right. Just to make that clear, do we have an application in hand for this proposal, or is this basically what we have is just an unsolicited kind of letter?
Through the chair, an unsolicited proposal, by definition, generally is high level in nature. The bylaw that we do have for unsolicited proposals contemplates the fact that these would not be detailed in nature. In that policy that we do have, there has to be a determination of whether that makes logical sense for the region to consider it. And if it is considered, then we'd ask for a more detailed proposal from the proponent. And then, in fact, we'd have to then take that out for an RFP. At this point in time, this would be a pretty significant strategic direction for council to undertake. Staff feels that there is merit to the proposal and that further consideration should be undertaken, but we don't want to undertake that step unless council is fully aware that we are going to consider this. And so therefore the direction is for council to weigh whether this is something that they want staff to continue to look at.
Okay, thank you for that. And I know when we got the proposal, it seemed to me it was too good to be true, and perhaps it was, because now it's changed materially from that. So I'm going to ask the obvious. Why do you think the proponents have changed the parameters in this way, through you, Chair? Because they couldn't make it the way it was, I'm assuming, so they've asked for more benefits to be approved by council.
Through the chair, I don't want to speak on behalf of the proponents, but it would make sense to me that due to the nature of the cost of these buildings and the income that these buildings generate, that it would make some sense that they required more fiscal room in their proposal. And I think their letter kind of indicates that fact, that to make these things come to fruition, they would need a bit more incentive.
Right, and I think that's all understandable. In no way am I suggesting that I'm rejecting what they're asking for. I just want to clarify so we know where we are with it.
So, sorry, Councillor Volpatti, to your point about the staff direction, Commissioner Burgess has asked for staff direction to the point that staff be allowed to review it and provide a report. And I'm assuming,
well, we have 4 options.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to, we've just sort of put the report as it stands on the floor with Councillor
Well, I want to make
Height
a
and
motion
Councillor
about the options.
Easton, so I didn't know, sorry, Councillor Height, did you want to make a recommendation on one of the options?
I'd be really happy. I'd be more than happy to. I believe recommendation 2 is the one that staff might be looking at, would be the appropriate one, but I'm under
one. I think 1 or 2.
1 or 2.
No, I'm asking for 1, 2, and 3, and I'm asking through you to the commissioner why 1, 2, and 3 can't be approved today. Certainly not 4. I understand that, but why not 1, 2, and 3?
Okay, so
I'm happy with 1, 2, and 3 if staff.
If it makes sense.
Okay, through the chair, 3 would only apply if council has specific recommendations or changes today based upon the letter that we would then investigate. 2,
So 1 and 2 will do.
1 and 2 can do, yes.
All right, that's fine. My other question is this. When we come back with this report, what I would like clearly described in, you know, the words of the bylaw, whatever that bylaw is, under what circumstances Niagara Region forgives development charges and property taxes. I mean, I think it has to be a not-for-profit charitable, but I want the wording of whatever that bylaw is in that report, please. Because I hear a piece here and a piece there, and I just want to clarify that once and for all. And yeah, I'm happy. If we're doing 1 and 2, this proposal is not dead in the water. We're working on it, and I think that's what the proponents have to know. It might be a great model for us to use. This is really important as a pilot, and let's just get on with it, and let's hope that we get an application and they don't keep changing their minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Volpatti. So just to go back to Councillor Height for a second, and Councillor Easton, the motion is to direct staff to follow 1 and 2. Okay. And Councillor Volpatti has asked for some other information. You captured that for what you need. And I believe we would probably, if we are going down one of these routes, we would probably need an impact to the local area municipalities and their... Yeah, there'll be a full cost analysis.
A full cost analysis with this. I forgot to say that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Councillor Volpatti. Sorry to preempt you, Councillor Augustine, but you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, I agree with getting more information. It sounds like there's some, certainly some validity here. And I wonder if this is the only approach to take, the municipal asset, or it can be some other approach to achieve the same goal. So information coming back in terms of if this were owned by Bethlehem Projects or Bethlehem Housing and Support Services, if it was owned by them, would they pay? If it was owned by the city, would they, you know, and that's sort of essentially what they're proposing. The other, I think, important piece, Mr. Chair, would be, and staff talked about it, but I didn't see it written here, what happens if the use changes in the future, 25 years down the road, and all of a sudden they say, you know what, we've solved the problem, we don't need it anymore, or something changes, etc. So those clauses to get out of this, and I think about other arrangements that we've had through the years here at the region to make sure that there's always that clause where you kind of pull out and say, okay, it'll only be in this place if, or if there's a certain percentage of units as opposed to, etc. So that the goal that we have, which is more affordable housing and housing with supports, is sustained, but also if that changes, you know, this exemption isn't allowed. So as long as that, Mr. Chair, can be included in the report, I'm very supportive of continuing to investigate.
Thank you, Councillor Augustine. Staff has captured that. Thank you. Councillor Easton.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak to this in my capacity as the chair of the Alternate Service Delivery Audit Committee. Certainly, this is offering solutions at a pretty big scale. And I agree with earlier speakers that to keep this alive, but to be very certain that it is included as part of that analysis certainly should be, and I'm sure that Mr. Burgess is keeping that in mind. I think we need to look at every option that's out there, and with the new resources that we have in Niagara Regional Housing, I'm certain that we can analyze this to everyone's benefit. Thank you very much.
Excellent comment, Councillor Easton. Staff take that as well under advisement. Chair Castleton.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to comment on the letter from Sullivan Manny. I'm not sure if anybody can read this. It looks like it's been faxed and copied so many times that it's ineligible. So, you know, if we're going to put something in our package, we ought to make sure that it's readable. Here, read this to me. Anyway, sorry. With respect to what's happening here, we've included in our strategic plan affordable housing, and we've also thrown out the number, I have thrown out the number of 1,000 units built per term. I think this is a major step forward in our ability to do that. Now, it's already been said that by Councillor Easton that this is a significant move towards alternate service delivery, and I tend to agree. We're always searching for ways to partner with private entities so that we can make things happen faster, quicker, and to the benefit of Niagara. So I think this is a great example of making that work and achieving our end goal. I know this will impact the city of St. Catharines, the host city, wherever it happens to be. Have we checked with the city on their notion of adopting this?
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to direct that question to the CAO.
Through Chair to Chair Caslin, on May 1st, we met with the partners, and it's good to see these partners coming together. First Credit, Pantera, and Bethlehem getting together. But also at that meeting was representatives of Niagara Falls, City of St. Catharines, and the City of Welland, who are all supportive of the project and this proposal.
Well, excellent. That's what I wanted to hear. As I said before, I've been the proponent of trying to build as many houses as we can. As we know, we've got a housing wait list of about 6,000 people. If we only built 1,000 per term, that would take us 24 years to complete. So let's try and do that faster and better. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Caslin. I see Councillor Volpatti
Yeah,
has
just one
up
quick
for a brief second time.
Yes, please. It's really critical for me to understand how this whole discussion in this report impacts the DC bylaw that we're currently working on, if it does, and how it does. And I think that should be included as part of the report, because the bylaw is open for discussion now, and it's important that we do that.
Commissioner?
I'll just, very quick question through the chair, very quick answer through the chair. The DC bylaw has changes in it around affordable housing where we give on a pro rata basis, essentially a deferral for the social housing unit. So or an exemption, sorry. I'm being corrected on the terminology, but an exemption on the DCs on a pro rata basis. This is a different approach because it's being deemed as a municipal capital asset, which is a different, it would be outside of that bylaw, would be part of the Municipal Act. But we will provide implications on what are the broader terms as far as potential implications on DCs.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no further speakers, I'll call the question, and the motion to receive the report, direct staff to follow options 1 and 2, and to provide further information. Councillor Height. Recorded vote, please. Do I vote if there's a recorded vote on, sir? Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I've signed off for the purpose of this vote then.
Okay.
The vote is open? So it don't show up as a no.
Okay.
It's still a conflict.
Fantastic, thank you. Unanimous. Okay. Next item of business I have is a mover and seconder for the consent items for information. The remaining ones are 6.6, a memorandum from Sterling Wood, Acting Director of Legal and Court Services, and CSD 32-2017, property transactions under delegate authority. Could I have a mover and seconder for those two items? Councillor Volpatti and Councillor Easton. Any questions to those items? Councillor Gale? Sorry, Councillor Timms. Councillor Gale had asked to comment on one of the things, and I know we're getting close to losing quorum.
Thank you, Chair. On item CSC 9-2017, I'd like to make a motion of a deferral on that till the next cycle, so that, do we have quorum? Okay, so that Director Wood can get his notes together as he's described. But I'd like to put this to bed. That's why I say I'd like to have it next cycle of corporate services. Yeah.
So we are, it's a motion to refer the memorandum for one cycle. Can I just bear with me 1 second?
He's waiting for, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So that motion is in order, Councillor Gale, for items CSC 917 to ask for a deferral of one cycle. Do you have a seconder, sir? Oh, sorry, Councillor Volpatti. All those in favor?
Mr. Chair. Sorry, Mr. Chair, just on this, what's the effect of this to those reports?
That's what I want to know. Like, is this going to defer again?
Sorry, I want to make
Maybe
sure
I'm
we're on the right
confused about
report
what
because
this
there's a
memo is.
comment on it.
So through
Chair,
the
this is a report
sorry.
from, oh,
Sorry,
okay.
through the chair, the effect is, in this memo, Director of Legal Services is asking for committee's direction on proceeding with getting an external legal opinion on the request, which has a financial cost to it. So if we defer it, it just means that we're deferring getting an external legal opinion. That's the only thing that this memo deals with.
So I don't know what's going on at the courthouse today, but the issue is if that injunction or whatever doesn't occur, does this mean that those reports then from the Integrity Commissioner can come forward to council? I don't want to stop those reports.
Councillor Augustine, I'm going to direct this to our acting director.
Through you, Chair, I believe it's, as Commissioner Bird just indicated, it's simply a direction to me to either get the legal opinion or not. There's a resolution before council, or made by council last session, that still stands, and whatever we do with this memo doesn't change it.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarity on that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to point of order, or whatever you want to call this.
Your point of order?
Yes. We have a memorandum we could receive and defer any action, but I'd like to have it received. And then, because the memorandum doesn't, and there's no recommendation in it or on it, so simply receive, we don't need to take any action on it until we hear what happens today, till we hear about Bill 68. What's my point of order? I'd like to see it received.
Councillor Timms, I don't disagree with your point of order. However, the motion to defer the receipt, we've made a motion to receive, and now that we are deferring that motion to receive, that's in order. So the deferral of one cycle, I think it has the same effect, but as I see it, it's the same. The actual procedures that we followed are in order. Yeah, but Councillor D'Angelo is going to raise another point of order.
Yeah, I want to just be clear. So by deferring this, our solicitor will not take any actions until next meeting. Is that what I'm hearing?
As I understand it, and I will go to the commissioner, the intent of deferring this is that our acting director will not hire an outside legal services to review the corporate service, but does not change any of the other direction that was provided at council last Thursday, week ago Thursday. Am I correct?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you for the clarity.
Okay. So it's not debatable. It's unless there's a point of order. Councillor Volpatti, is there anything out of order? Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I thought you said I have a question. My apologies. A long 24 hours, folks. I will now call the question on deferring item CSC C927. All in favor of deferring one cycle? Opposed, if any? That is deferred. Thank you. Item CSD 32-2017. Sorry, Councillor Timms, were you to speak to that item, or did you want to speak to the other one? No. Okay. Seeing no speakers to the property transactions under delegated authority, all in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Thank you. Do we have any questions for the closed item sessions? In that case, could I please have a motion to, how do we do that if we don't go to closed session? We just okay, so we don't have any questions going to closed session, so we have a motion to receive the reports. Councillor Volpatti, moving. No, I'm sorry, Chair Council. We've moved to the closed session items 9.1 and 9.2. I can read the titles, right? In open session? Yeah. So the confidential report CST 27-2017, a matter regarding a proposed disposition of the land by municipality, Hayner Street in St. Catharines, and confidential report CST 31-2017, a matter reporting a proposed disposition of land, part of 5028 520 Montrose Road, Niagara Falls. If there's no questions to those.
I stand corrected, thank you.
Sorry. Questions to either of those items? If so, we'll go into closed session to ask the questions.
Well, just a couple of points. It says to be distributed in my hard copy, and I can't pull it up on my computer either. So I do have questions.
Okay. Questions, we need to go in closed sessions to ask those questions. Can I get a motion to move into closed session, please? Councillor D'Angela and Councillor Timms, all in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Can we move into closed session, please?
I can't pull up these reports either, so can we get hard copies?
So anyone who needs a copy? I'm going to look to Councillor Height because he was going to go straight to it. But we'll wait for the light to come on or off. We're good. Are we in open? Oh, we got to wait for. If it's red, it means we're enclosed.
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Point of order, Councillor Augustine.
I would ask staff, or maybe this is something for the Procedure Bylaw Committee to look at. Since we can't vote in closed session, I don't know how we ever vote to go into open session in closed session. I think we need to say the closed session's over and then vote in open session to leave closed session. So it's something to look at in the future. If that makes any sense to anybody.
Excellent topic for the procedural bylaw, and I look forward to bringing it up, Councillor Augustine, there. We are now in open session. At this time, I would ask for a mover of the two reports, Councillor Height, seconded by Councillor Volpatti. We've had questions. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Those are carried. Thank you very much. I'm looking to Councillor Volpatti for other business.
Chair, I have two items. First of all, for members of the committee, there's a charrette tomorrow afternoon in Committee Room 4 on the campus master plan. And it should be a very interesting time to ask all the questions we have about a very important project. 1 to 4.
Lunch is provided.
Oh, and lunch is provided. Boom. Wow, okay. With drinks? No. Lunch. And my second request, actually it's a motion, that the legal costs of all integrity commissioner issues and the legal costs of all lawsuits involving councillors to date, along with a forecast of those costs in cases of which we are aware. I hope so. I want a report, please. It's a motion for a report. I am doing it in form of a motion, so it's all captured, please.
Before we go to questions on that motion, Councillor Volpatti, Councillor Burgess just wants clarification.
Yes.
And I won't take the elected position of councillor that the chair just gave me. Just for clarity, you're looking for our external legal, the region's external legal costs with regards to legal fees, or also our internal cost as far as time spent by staff on those matters?
I think all.
All, okay, so we will.
All costs.
Okay, we'll try to describe that. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. We're going to pay for itself.
We have Secretary Gale, sorry, Councillor Gale. Any questions to that? Seeing none, all in favor? So Councillor Edgar and Councillor Height are declaring conflict. Sorry, Councillor D'Angelo, do you want to ask a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just clarity on staff's comment. I was going to put an amendment that we track staffing costs, but I heard the acting commissioner just say the legal costs. Are you tracking all staffing costs related to these issues, or just legal costs?
My motion was for legal costs.
Sorry, so motion for legal costs, and I heard Commissioner Burgess said that they could track the staff time of legal departments. So staff, legal, and external legal costs.
Well, we don't have the ability. Our legal department bills on a docket basis, so they can look at their dockets. But for other staff, we don't necessarily have a docket basis for issues, so we would just be taking a guess at some of that stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Councillor Augustine?
I need to declare a conflict. Well, first of all, a point of order. I don't know how we're doing other business after closed session, so it's not in order. The second item is I need to declare a conflict of interest with regards to this because I am one of the named councillors. There's 24 of us. And so I need to declare a conflict of interest on this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Augustine. As someone else is named on that lawsuit, I wouldn't declare a conflict because there's no pecuniary interest in me knowing how much the region is spending on that issue.
Yeah.
So, but thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, we have 3 noted.
Mr. Chair, I'm not going to declare a conflict. I'm named, but I don't think it's a conflict. So, thank you.
it's up to individual councillors to decide whether they have a conflict at any given issue and whether they vote or not. I see 3 declared conflicts: Councillor Augustine, Councillor Edgar, Councillor Height. Any other declared conflicts? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. All opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. And Councillor Augustine, I apologize for jumping other business before the closed session. I jumped. Yeah, and I apologize for that. Motion to adjourn. Seeing none, our next meeting is May 31st at 9:30 in this room.